Here, I've been told that we are trying to bring it up to, I don't know, Northern Europe anyway, in terms of, rather than the Arctic Circle. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff DeVelco. It's a real pleasure to join you and come back to the Wilson Center, collaborating with colleagues here at a program that I had the good fortune of working with for quite a while and continue to now at Ohio University as a professor. And so our concluding panel, Countering Violence, Building Peace, obviously brings many of the topics under discussion for the day together in critical ways, just like all the discussions have had depth, but also connection as a theme. We're very fortunate to have a very dynamic panel, and I'll keep their introductions very short so you can hear from me and then read more detail about the speakers. You can hear from them. So we're going to start with Jack Goldstone, who is the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University. He's also a Wilson Center Fellow, someone who's been a very good friend to the center and is gracing this stage for, I don't know, I'm sure it's in the double digits at this point in terms of sharing his insights on these issues with us. Then we'll go to Vanita Datta, who is the CVE advisor in the Bureau for Africa at U.S. Agency for International Development, also a longtime partner of the Wilson Center, and we so much appreciate that partnership and that support. Finally, I won't call him the prodigal son, but Mike Jobbins comes back to the Wilson Center, a former staffer here at the Wilson Center. Mike is now Senior Program Manager at Africa, Search for Common Ground, doing really important work around the world, and particularly, obviously, focusing on Africa for Mike. So it's great to welcome him back to the center. So Jack, we'll turn the floor over to you. And we might, since he has slides, we might want to slide out so we can see them and they can see the slides. Yes.
Thank you, Jeff. It is terrific to be here at the Wilson Center. I've had the pleasure of being here for the entire year as a visiting scholar instead of just dropping in as I usually do. It's been a chance for me to know even more about the excellent work that the Wilson Center does here in many areas, including Africa. Today's program is called Beyond the Headlines, and you've heard a lot about the headlines already. Population growth in Sahel is extreme, the environment is fragile, security is afflicted by frequent conflicts. If we're going to look beyond that, we want to look for ways to reduce those risks and reduce that fragility. We heard this morning about the importance of resilience, and I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience and conflict. What makes a state resilient with regard to conflict is being legitimate, effective, and inclusive. If people come to trust the state and public institutions, they have less need to work through private networks to get around the state or to protect their group at the expense of others. But it's difficult to build strong, effective states when populations are growing very rapidly, when people lack the education to be empowered members of society. And so the things we've talked about, population growth, education, and security, are all deeply intertwined. And this is the reason that the relationship that Dr. Sankata put up remains very strong throughout the world and throughout history. When you have societies that have effective government, those governments are able to provide education. Fertility declines, that allows a greater investment in young people. As young people grow up feeling more in control of their own destinies, they're more likely to turn to constructive group activities and less likely to be drawn to deviant or extremist movements out of anger or frustration. They're more likely to be engaged in building society and strengthening it. This is a phase that all societies have gone through, but we've seen that Africa, and particularly the Sahel, seem to be lagging in making this demographic, educational, and democratic transition. They're all tied together, and I'm going to talk now in just a few minutes about the magnitude of these issues. So Africa does have a fast-growing population. This makes it potentially the world's greatest resource for the future. As you can see from this graph, in another 10 or 20 years, Africa will become the only part of the world where the labor force is continuing to grow. So in a sense, the future of the entire world economy depends on whether the young people of Africa grow up with the skills to be productive, to find steady jobs, and to move the global economy ahead. Now, there's no simple relationship, I should say, between jobs and violence. You can have a high level of employment, but if people are employed in low-income, dead-end jobs, they may grow quite frustrated. And one of the difficulties with Africa's economy is that so many people are in an informal sector working at precarious or part-time jobs. So that kind of work is not going to lift the region forward. We have a huge young population that's eager for education and work. In fact, it's so large that for Africa as a whole, roughly 1 in 4 children in the world today is growing up in Africa. By mid-century, it'll be about 40%. So the education, the socialization, and the stability of the young people in this region of the world is going to be, I think, the dominant issue for conflicts in the years ahead. Now, we've talked about the need for education, but education needs to be seen as part of a holistic social system. You can't just invest in one part of the system. Same thing with contraception. You can't simply make contraceptives more available. You have to deal with the entire social system that supports a high desired family size, that makes women limited in their empowerment so that they essentially need to please their husbands who want large numbers of children. You can't just essentially poke the beast in one part and expect to really change things. So what's happened in education is that Africa has actually been very successful in primary education. So these numbers here, these are Africa as a whole. You have Ethiopia, Nigeria, Niger from the Sahel represented up here. But these countries actually have not only 100% of the children of primary age school in primary education, they also have many young people and even adults who have passed out of the normal primary school years taking primary education to make up the deficits of lack of education when they were young. So this has been very successful. And one of the reasons it's been so successful is that USAID influenced by a study showing that the greatest economic return is on primary education, determined to put all of its efforts into making sure that Africa had universal primary education, or as near to it as they could. However, secondary education was kind of left as a later step. Once we've got everybody in primary education, then we'll build secondary. The problem with that is that even though there have been great steps in literacy and primary education, it so far had essentially no effect on fertility in Africa. What we've found in Africa is that urbanization and income growth by themselves have not changed family structure. They haven't changed the desire for large families. They haven't changed the dominance of men in determining family size. What seems to change that is allowing women to stay in school until age 18. If you take women out of school at age 12 and say they've had a primary education, that's excellent. They're still available for marriage at 14, 15, 16. They start marriage early, they have very large families, and they don't change the basic family dynamic. They don't get into that demographic dividend that arises once fertility starts a rapid decline. So these deficits, this difference between secondary education and primary education has become vast, the largest in the world, very marked. Look at Niger, 71% primary education, but only 16% secondary education. And for women, it's near zero. So this is, I think, the big gap that needs to be addressed. But delivering secondary education is a holistic process. You have to give families enough income that they can keep their children in school. You have to produce secondary school teachers, which requires enough tertiary school investment to produce competent teachers. And you need an administrative structure that can deliver sophisticated textbooks, basic shop and laboratory materials. Secondary education is a substantial investment. But at this point, it's the lack of that investment that's probably the major thing holding Africa back. The other area in which Africa really is separated from the rest of the world is in energy consumption. If you look at a map of the world at night, Africa is still the dark continent. Hackneyed as that phrase is, it does apply to the energy spectrum of the African continent. So in 2008, 0.32 tons of carbon per person, and even that was only because Libya and South Africa are unusually heavy consumers in Africa. China, a little more than 20 times as much carbon output per person. So if Africa were to reach China's level per capita by 2060, the carbon emissions from Africa would be as much as Europe, China, and the US combined. Africa needs to develop, but it needs to develop in a largely carbon-free fashion. Otherwise, it's going to overwhelm all of the gains and benefits made from solar, wind, and other energy conservation in China, Europe, and America. Is there a pathway by which Africa can develop and get the energy it needs to light up the continent without becoming a major consumer of fossil fuels? The potential is there. Africa has huge potential resources for hydro, wind, and solar power, but it will require a very different model of development. And the race is on, because right now Africa is urbanizing. As we've heard today, Africa is urbanizing at an extremely rapid pace. Urban populations want air conditioning, transportation, the construction of large buildings. All of this increases the demand for energy in a hurry. And so Africa right now is facing a choice: how do we build our future? We need development, but if it embarks on a fossil-rich energy path, it is going to overwhelm the progress that's been made. And the reason for that is simply the potential for enormous population growth. Now, education, stability, and family planning can bend the curve in the Sahel. Nigeria is on course right now for a population of 440 million by 2050. And it's not impossible. Nigeria is a large country. It's potentially rich. The difficulty is you don't get that demographic dividend from young people if each generation is 10 or 15% larger than the next. You have to keep ramping up your investment just to keep pace with the number of school children, with the number of houses you need. You don't increase the per capita income or the per capita investment in children until that fertility curve starts to go down. Now, how rapidly can it change? Here's the good news that you don't see in the headlines. It is quite possible, we've seen it, to bend the curve of population growth with investment in secondary school education. My research team has done some projections and estimates modeling the effect of secondary school education for women on rates of fertility. And we did this with Tanzania, not part of the Sahel admittedly, but a country with quite good demographic and education data available, and was convenient for this modeling exercise. So here's the UN medium scenario for population growth. Today, around 50 million people live in Tanzania. The projection is this will grow almost sixfold by the end of the century if nothing changes. Now, even if secondary enrollment grows a little bit, that will not be sufficient to bend the curve. We really need a massive effort because the population is growing so rapidly. If you increase secondary school education at a lower rate than population growth, you fall behind rather than get ahead. So the trick is to get secondary enrollment up to a substantially higher rate than population growth. If you do that, this is what happens to the projected population growth curve. Now, there's a whole volume this thick from the Vienna Demographic Institute arguing that all of our projections about global population growth are overstated because if we allow for growth of education, we're going to get this instead of that. My response to them is, you are right if we can coordinate the response to educate and empower women, increase the availability of jobs that fit educational qualifications, allow governments to develop that are sufficiently legitimate and effective, that conflict does not undermine the stability of the educational system. Conflict is terribly destructive. We have new studies coming out all the time that show how conflict undermines development. In Syria today, an entire generation is losing its education because of the conflict that has taken over that country. Refugees who go to refugee camps do not get the same educational progress that children do who grow up in their own homes. So conflict is enormously destructive, but this cycle of stopping conflict requires a combination of investments, not only in education and contraception, but also in building governments that are inclusive, effective, and legitimate. And that element if it's lacking, as it so often is, undermines all of the other efforts as well. Now, you can even get, if you get 100% net secondary enrollment in the near term, you can reduce the population to about a doubling. Now, this green curve represents improvement in fertility at the same rate that Iran experienced. Iran, of course, a Muslim country, but one that had a very effective state family planning program and that experienced a huge investment in women's education after the Islamic Revolution. And if Tanzania could get on the same path as Iran, population would not even double in this century. I think that's probably optimistic, but these two curves here look a lot better than these curves here for building a secure future. So let me stop there with this optimistic message. If one country can do it, as Iran did, as Senegal is doing, as Rwanda is doing, other countries can too. The difficulty, of course, is that every country has its own culture, its own traditions, its own mode of government, and therefore each one needs to develop its own set of programs with community involvement, with a combination of international support, but also grassroots, ground-up engagement in building education, women's rights, and stable governance. But as I say, it has been done, it can be done. The Sahel faces huge problems, to be sure. It is facing massive population growth. It is facing environmental decay. It has a history of violent conflict. But other parts of the world have faced similar problems, and if they're able to build the social institutions and the human capital to acquire resilience, then these problems can be overcome, and I think prosperity can be acquired. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say first thank you to the Wilson Center for their kind hospitality, and thank you to you all, ladies and gentlemen. I want to preface my remarks by a comment that I heard from a very old and wise mentor of mine. Every time he finished a lecture or a discussion, he always said, "And I reserve the right to get smarter about it." So I'm going to preface my remarks by saying, and we reserve the right to get smarter. And this is truly important in this evolving nature of the Sahelian issue. I will touch upon a few points, but then highlight the United States government response, namely the United States Agency for International Development response. Let me frame my remarks with a few key points. Point one, security, violence, instability, extremism has a lot to do with the interplay between environment and population. Fact, the Sahel is plagued with chronic poverty. 8.7 million people, after suffering 3 climatic shocks in 2012, voted with their feet. They continue to do so. They're in dire situations due to severe drought for the third time, as I mentioned. Millions of people leave home, and it's important that these people who work on survival modes are assisted. We have to get ahead of this vulnerability curve. Point number 2, headline grabbing responses denote the symptom and the response to the symptom, but they don't adequately address the causative analysis regarding the dynamics at play. Point 3, the population and environmental situations are evolving. Our responses also have to evolve and be dynamic. Therefore, the application of any response has to be calibrated to the dynamic situation in any particular area. Point 4, and related to the above, I will bring in the conflict and extremism factor. The drivers of extremism and their insecurity and response applications have to be considered holistically. They have to be applied in a targeted and customized manner. So while we work across countries and regions, we have to view the situation in terms of provinces, localities, and even neighborhoods. We have to ensure that the interventions we design, the counter-security, counter-extremism solutions, that benefit is significant enough to justify the intervention. And we have to think of unintended consequences. Having said that, let me explain how we go about these efforts. Our foreign assistance framework on peace and security, among other priority objectives such as governing justly and democratically, humanitarian assistance, economic development, to name a few, education notwithstanding, we work on all these areas very closely with our state and defense colleagues under the aegis of the Sahel Maghreb Oversight Committee and the Trans-Sahara Counter-Terrorism Partnership within national security guidelines. Via these frameworks, we consider the framing of policy, the execution, implication, and evaluation of these. This is done in conjunction with our diplomatic missions, host country governments, other donors, multilateral agencies, such as the ECOWAS, the Global Counterterrorism Forum, the United Nations, the African Union, to name a few. We work on these consistent with broader strategic frameworks and our policy on countering violent extremism, and of course our other frameworks on conflict assessment. These provide United States Agency for International Development with clear mandate and guidelines of how to proceed. We have to look at these guidances and frameworks with our national security guidelines to frame our responses. So sometimes when people get frustrated, why isn't the government moving faster? Now, what is the US doing about it? We have to bring our host country governments into the situation. We don't have a US face to many of these problems. We have to ensure there's local and national capacity building to these issues. All of this says that development is integral to the security response and the diplomacy response. So the Agency for International Development. Oh, am I not being clear? Am I cutting out here? Have you missed most of my talk? Okay. I might as well just talk in Hindi then. Okay. This is not just a US face to counter violent extremism, but a partnership in progress, and we continue to pilot and calibrate our responses. You see, we reserve the right to get smarter. It's an iterative learning process. Based on country conditions, we factor in violence and radicalism and the lack of community resiliency as key development challenges and points to be considered in our program design. The threat of violence and extremism in the Sahel and in other parts of the world stem from multiple factors that can be viewed via diverse lenses and categories. A lack of civic engagement by governments, despite vibrant civil societies in these areas, and perception that there is a lack of legitimate engagement with no efficacy. A disaffection, alienation, oppression, suppression of burgeoning youth, men and women, and other marginalized groups, stemming from constricted channels to express identity and belief. And sometimes a notion that is perpetuated by radical influencers, that violence is permitted or even encouraged by religion. To address grievances, a lack of transparency in public financial management, which lots of people have adhered to, a blurry sense of the future for these aspiring peoples that makes the notion of citizenship diffuse. United States government, USAID's CVE programming, tries to address both the push and the pull factors leading to radicalization and extremism. These programs strengthen the links between country governments, influential leaders, and youth. Our policies in this arena represents an ongoing drive to use ours and others' long experience and vast knowledge base to provide crucial thought leadership to the development field. Let me say this, clarifying USAID's role in the context of security, violent extremism, and insurgency does not come without controversy. Some hold very strong views that no development agency should work in the nexus of security and militarism, or even in areas where there is war. USAID in particular thinks long and hard about these issues. Programming resources to respond to violent extremism and interagency requires that the agency assumes greater institutional and operational risk, and a lot of questions from all sectors. Again, we reserve the right to get smarter as we start putting our feet in and working in all these issues. In the World Bank's recent World Development Report, it was made very clear that the costs of conflict, developmental, economic, and human, are simply too costly to ignore. By not confronting where we can those development-related factors that drive conflict and violent extremism and insurgency, we'll ignore the plight of many around the world in great need. Already today, close to 60% of state and USAID's foreign assistance goes to 50 countries that are in the midst of or trying to prevent conflict and state failure. Our agency's renewed emphasis on learning, innovation, and risk-taking means we will study and improve our work in exactly those areas that have proven most difficult. In the Sahel, we are mapping risk and capabilities with a geospatial analysis along with our development outcomes and fundamental development learning. We want to target our programming both as buffers against instability, violence, and to bolster current and future resilience against climactic shocks. And again, we reserve the right to get smarter. Before I go on any further, let's bust some myths and consider how extremism and insecurity play out in an arena plagued with environmental shocks, poverty, and a growing peri-urban youth population with current extremists and action undertaken to stem that extremism. Myth: poverty has a lot to do with violent extremism and insecurity. Well, that's half a myth actually. The population below the poverty level in the Sahel is more than 55%. However, large segments of this population are not recruits nor violently engaged with their community or their government. However, this poor or below poverty segment is vulnerable to being recruited and will lack the resiliencies to adequately buffer themselves against the onslaught of extremists, nor resist the pull of their recruitment modalities and become victims of repeat environmental and/or insecurity occurrences. Ironically, direct explicit concern with ameliorating the economic conditions of these people is not the primary concern of the Boko Haram or other violent extremist organizations, though they are important recruitment tools. Myth: providing increased goods and services will diminish the underlying conditions for terrorist support. Actually, it's not just that. It's the unmet expectations of upwardly mobile groups, cohort dynamics, and social networks that have a larger influence as evidenced by research sponsored by various governments and private groups. Myth: ungoverned spaces are a sanctuary for terrorist organizations. Increasing government presence in those areas will eliminate sanctuaries. In point of fact, ungoverned spaces may become a vacuum that terrorist organizations may want to fill, or become pockets of insecurity. However corrupt, weak states in peri-urban and urban areas, poor services, lack of psychosocial, judicial, and educational equities, brutality towards women, children, and communities, the lack of education that has been mentioned before, garner more recruits than just the fact that places are ungoverned. I see lots of heads nodding in that area. Myth: the security problem is a national sovereignty issue. Yes, true to the extent of preserving the state, but the problem has evolving regional dimensions, and accountability, governance, and sovereignty have to take on a regional aspect while preserving the sense of the state. Myth: communication and symbolism are unimportant, and a security response that is tactical and relies on a system of tight control or retribution or punitive actions will clear an area of insurgency. This is a practice followed by some Sahelian countries with the help of regional security forces. Again, that is certainly one way, but perhaps not the optimum way. Targeted messaging, a hybrid approach with security, community outreach, psychosocial justice, and education, perhaps will be more effective, along with local and national capacity building, a goods and services program with a local face that buffers communities against small and large shocks of violent extremism, famine, drought, with a long-range plan calibrated to the changing environment, will be a judicious response and a far better way to prevent and counter violence and perpetuate security. So what have we done in this arena as part of the USG response to mitigate the situation and enable those most directly impacted? As mentioned by Deputy Assistant Secretary Bisa Williams during lunch, the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, the TSCTP, under the aegis of that, in 2006, we started a modest pilot program in 3 countries in the Sahel, Chad, Niger, and Mali, by adapting program models that really garnered very calibrated responses. We looked at our development sectors such as conflict mitigation, local governance, community-based media, and youth programming. Then we released in 2009 a guide to the drivers of violent extremism and programming on development assistance. We wanted to ensure that we had a dynamic research base with on-the-ground truth that was fed into our programming and constantly reiterated our programming linked with these ground truths. We also have a CVE policy. In 2011, it was developed. As I mentioned, we conducted several regional and local risk-based assessments in about 8 of the 11 Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership countries. The information of these become a dynamic feedback play for us, and we constantly go back to the communities and research our program modalities to ensure that we are being current and effective. In 2015, we'll have the first regional risk assessment in the Lake Chad area and also in the Horn of Africa, and we'll also focus on women in conflict. Based on this analysis, our programs concentrate on youth empowerment, media, messaging, promoting moderate voices, improve local governance, and in certain conditions, reconciliation and conflict mitigation, the areas where we see the greatest opportunity for local partnership and progress. Each activity, as I mentioned, is tailored to meet specific threat levels, political environments, and material needs of each country. Our counter-extremism efforts target narrow populations that generally aren't reached by other programs. We reach out to young men and increasingly young women, community groups, mothers, children, elders, religious leaders. Those groups most likely to be influenced by extremist groups, and B, those groups that can provide mentorship and guidance to support community stability. We believe, again, that this targeting will counter and buffer against violent extremism and shocks. We focus on sensing and responding to a situation, and then ensuring that we bolster against future shocks via resilience and capacity development programming. And let me just narrow down then to a few examples. In Niger, USAID's programs, both bilateral and regional, address threat of violent extremism caused by social marginalization and political exclusion. Working with vulnerable communities in the regions of Agadez, Difa, Bosu, Maradi, we look at locally managed programs to promote resistance to instability and extremism among youth and generate dialogue between local communities and marginalized groups. And let's take the example of the 2014 execution of our RISE program, that's Resilience in the Sahel Enhanced Initiative. This program consists of more than $130 million over the first 2 years of a 5-year effort to build resilience to recurrent crises in the Sahel. It brings together humanitarian and development funding to both address humanitarian needs, including efforts to strengthen institutions and increase sustainable governance and economic well-being. We're hoping to help 1.9 million beneficiaries in this area. In the wake of the recently held Countering Violent Extremism Summit promoted by President Obama, we now have regional summits in West Africa. We are hoping then this will be a lead-up to the Leaders Summit on Violent Extremism in the margins of the United Nations General Assembly, where we can really address the problems in the interplay of environment, populations, conflict, and stability. This has such an important hold, not only for the Sahelian states, but its impact is far-reaching. A lot more needs to be done, and in other countries are increasingly leaning forward along with the host governments to cover gaps, build capacity in Sahelian states where environment, population, and security have such a strong nexus. The development of the peace accord in Mali, the peaceful transition of power in Nigeria, all avenues for current stability and progress are unfolding in this current period, with enhanced cooperation from regional and international partners. We wish that well. And again, we reserve the right to get smarter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Vanita, and thanks a lot, Jeff, for the kind introduction. For those of you who saw the invitation earlier, I am a stand-in. I'm standing in for my colleague Chambagu, who couldn't make it due to a health emergency. He's doing fine for those of you who are concerned. And I'm here to do my level best to carry the water at the end of a very rich panel, at the end of a very rich day. And I wanted to thank the Wilson Center for organizing this and to taking really a interdisciplinary approach to what is perhaps something that we often look at through our own narrow windows. I'm here as part of an operational NGO, a civil society group, and so joining colleagues from academia, from government, and from the big institutions of the world on stage to think about these issues and to share our own experiences is quite an honor and a privilege, and I hope that you'll indulge us that we come at it from a bit of an operational experience. But not operating clickers. So Search for Common Ground, we are one of the largest conflict transformation organizations in the world. We have offices throughout the Sahel. We're one of the few groups operating in Maiduguri in Nigeria right now. We work in Chad, in Niger, in Mali, Mauritania, all with the vision of transforming conflict. And whenever we begin a talk on the Sahel, I always like to start with a photo. I don't know if you can tell with the picture, but that's Mansa Musa. And it's a map of the Sahel circa 1375 that was drawn in North Africa. And I always like to begin with that for a few reasons. One of those is to remember that this is an area with rich culture, with a rich history, and with a rich way of addressing the different kinds of challenges of incorporating young people, of managing agricultural systems, of resolving disputes between farmers and pastoralists that goes back centuries. And often, as we talk about these, we forget. So that's the first reason. I think the second reason is that the fall of both the decline of the Malian Empire, the House of Bakwai, and a number of the other civilizations that grace the Sahel region were due not only to the local situation, but it was due to the invention of the caravel and to the growth of the Atlantic trade, the role that the Portuguese and others played as trade was oriented southwards to the coast and onwards to Europe, rather than through caravans across the Sahara. And that's because when we talk about conflict in the Sahel is not only a local dynamic, but it's ultimately a geopolitical question. When we talk about conflict in Niger and Nigeria, we're not just talking about Nigerian cows and Nigerian kids, but we're also talking about American drones, we're talking about Libyan bombs, we're talking about Libyan boats. And we can't forget that that's also what we're here to talk about today. And that the demographic challenges, it's true that they're urgent for the people who live in these countries, but it's also very true that it's important for the entire world that security in the Sahel be understood as intrinsic to security for all of us. Oh. There we go. And so if we start with Sahel in 1375, I think this is another important graphic that blew my mind when I read it. It came from IFPRI, from their 2013 Climate Change and Agriculture in Africa. And what was shocking was this is the malnutrition rate projected in 2050 in Niger, over 1 million. And significantly, that even under the best case optimistic scenarios, we're looking at an increase in the number of starving children in Niger. And fundamentally, that is a demographic challenge, and that is a climate change challenge, and that is a population challenge. But that's also an extremely worrying political challenge. If at the end of the day we're saying that the large number of frustrated young people is a risk of vulnerability for violent extremism, for intergroup conflict, now at 1 million people, the fact is that that number will not go down. If we look at, if we say that the unemployment is a core grievance of young people, if you look at the ILO statistics, the most likely scenario is no change in unemployment. Best case, a couple percentage points decrease. Worst case, a couple percentage points increase. But at the end of the day, unemployment is going to be with us. This is going to be a very poor region for a very long time, no matter what we do. And so often, we as civil society, and those of us who care very deeply about supporting development in the world, are accused and rightly accused of proposing tomorrow's solutions to today's problems. At the end of the day, there is no development solution to the problem of Boko Haram the solutions take too long. There is no environmental family planning solution today, although we want to see some sort of change tomorrow. And so, at the end of the day, we need to address what we see as three fundamentally existential threats that are felt by certain people, by people living across the Sahel. The first is fundamentally, what is the future for a young person growing up today in Zinder? What is the future for a young woman or a young man in Agadez, in Tillabéri, in Mao? What is the future of someone? What are their life options as they come of age, knowing that the jobs that they see on TV won't be for them? And how can you create an environment where, even though people may not have opportunity to provide, to participate in the economic life of society the way that they would like to, how do you create the sense that the people can at least participate in the social life of society? This was something that one of the other panelists talked to earlier, and I think it's a fundamental question, is how society deals with and incorporates these young people in ways recognizing that the economic model may not incorporate them immediately. Sani and others were talking earlier about entrepreneurship and about social systems that can create value even when the economic participation isn't there. The second is, what's the question of what's the future for pastoralists? We've seen a number of radical changes, both due to the droughts that were referenced earlier, due to insecurity and the increasing professionalization of the pastoral economy that we've seen through population growth and through the lack of updating of the couloir, the different migratory corridors that haven't been updated through since the 70s. And right now, pastoralists, like Ambassador Bisa Williams said, participate in some of the most troubling and vexing conflicts facing Nigeria and facing many other countries. Central African Republic is another. And what is the future for those populations? How are they incorporated into the Sahel of the future and their counterparts in the agricultural community? And the third is fundamentally, what is the third group that's facing existential threat is the state in the Sahel. We've already seen, as one of the panelists pointed out, we did have 9, now we have 11 Sahel states, both South Sudan and Eritrea in the eastern Sahel. In the western Sahel, Boko Haram obviously poses a very clear challenge to the Nigerian state and to its neighbors. We've seen the challenge to the state that's posed by the MNLA and others in northern Mali. And I would say that many other Sahelian governments, for one reason or another, may feel their people, if not as a threat to the entire state, at least to their leadership of the state. And that state governments themselves feel themselves to be at an existential crisis. And until the security concerns of those three actors, who both feel themselves to be weak and are themselves weak because of the economic, the demographic, and the climactic changes the world is undergoing, until those three groups can have some sort of accommodation of their need to exist or how they can exist in 2050, there can't be security in the Sahel. And so we said, as Search for Common Ground, as an organization committed to conflict transformation, to think through how you can begin, particularly as a civil society group, of addressing some of these three existential threats. And we question three assumptions. The first is the implicit assumption that we hear every day from political leaders, that we hear every day from experts. It was something that we heard in reference to the local decisions, but we hear it at the global level too. And that's the perception that young people in the Sahel are a problem to be solved. That's something that we hear when we talk about migrants towards Europe. That's something that we hear when we meet with government ministers. And that's something that young people feel and hear in their families, that ultimately youth are a problem. And of course, youth are citizens, youth are taxpayers. They're not problems, they're not solutions, but they are people with a legitimate stake in society. And until we can overcome that implicit language, that implicit assumptions, and begin supporting young people in ways that they themselves want, we can't see a better solution or achieve inclusion in any other way. The second is that that security is not the special preserve of the state. I think we heard earlier about the weaknesses of the state, and the fact is, on one hand, you have the weakest of institutions, asked to take on the most serious of tasks. And if you look yet at the response to the Boko Haram insurgency, for so many years, the security in northeastern Nigeria was left as a special preserve of the Nigerian state and Boko Haram. There were no humanitarian actors operating there. There were no human rights groups. There were none of the Nigerian civil society groups operating, bringing relief support until Bring Back Our Girls. It was the Nigerian government relief agencies, and it was the Nigerian security forces who were left to their own devices. And yet, if we know that we have such a weak state capacity, we need to recognize that we need new approaches for how we involve people. I mean, if you look at one of the reasons that the agreement in Mali has fortunately been close to conclusion, as we heard earlier today, but it's taken so long is because, if you listen to the negotiators, it was because of the lack of civil society input, the lack of women's input, the lack of the need to consult communities that themselves were directly affected. And until we get beyond that state-centric view of the security of this region, we will always be relying on the same broken instruments to fix the problem. And the third is the challenge of defining what we're for. I mean, we've heard a lot about countering violent extremism, and that's a useful negative definition of what many in the global policy community are looking for, and certainly a clear definition of the threat, but it's not a definition of a vision. And at the end of the day, if we can't articulate what kind of security we want to build in the Lake Chad Basin, if there's no positive vision articulated by the communities, by the 10 million people who live in the Lake Chad Basin, for how they want to see problems resolved and for how they want to see their security guaranteed, then there won't be sustaining peace, even if Boko Haram was to disappear tomorrow, or if the MNLA or ACME or others were to disappear tomorrow. If there's not a positive vision of security that involves community at peace with each other and government at peace with its own communities, there can't be a positive vision of security. And so we recognize those as the three core things that needed to happen. And our thought was, our approach in working in the Sahel was informed by a meeting we had with a very high-level Nigerian security official. We were talking about the Boko Haram insurgency and the military operations that were unfolding, and particularly some of the concerns about the human rights abuses that were going on during those operations. And the official said, I know what a military operation looks like. I know the negatives of this, the downsides of this approach. I know what that looks like. But at the end of the day, I only have one button. And if I only have one button and I have to do something, I'm going to push that button. And we see our role as a conflict transformation organization, as a civil society group, and I think that I hope many in the others in the audience would feel the same, that our role is to create another button, to create another approach to improving security that involves everyone in the Sahel, that involves women, that involves teachers, that involves medical professionals. And that's what we see our calling is doing. And we do that in three ways. The first is through changing how the state engages with its own citizens. We do this in Nigeria by organizing community forums to invite local security officials not to come and sensitize the people, but to come and explain themselves, to account for their actions, to explain what they're doing, to explain their own actions, and to take questions from people in a town hall format, not at the invitation of the government and not at the invitation of the security forces through a Hearts and Minds campaign, but rather at the invitation of the Nigerian people and the communities who are most affected. And once that trust and once that relationship is established, you can begin changing the way that forces themselves operate in communities, because they're entering through a framework of listening rather than coming as a sort of external mandate internal to the security forces alone. The second is working with young people. We're working with support from USAID as well as UNICEF and a number of private donors to work with young people about how they conceive of change within their society, recognizing that we're going to have a very large, very poor, and quite rightly very frustrated population for the foreseeable future. How do you work with young people on how they choose to articulate that change? How do you work with young people about how they choose and define the change that they want to see in their lives? And work with elders to understand that if they're not ready to listen to young people, that the young people will be drawn towards someone else who is ready to listen to them. And that's true, whether it's, ACME, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, whether it's political mobs and political youth gangs, whether it's criminals, smuggling networks, whether it's people traffickers, or any other kind of group. If there's no way to incorporate young people and no recognition either from young people that they want to be incorporated, nor an openness for them to be incorporated from the powers that be, then there can't be a solution, because others are providing that outlet. And the third is increasing community ownership of how disputes are managed. The region is undergoing a lot of changes. Between climate change, the population growth, the growth in livestock, and without any coherent, and with all of those changes that are happening at a macro level, older dispute resolution formats are not necessarily always applicable. For example, with the secession of South Sudan, the camel, cattle, and sheep migratory corridors have fundamentally changed in a way that no one expected and was not explained to communities. If you look at how people have been displaced from Nigeria towards Niger, or from Mali towards Niger, a number of new communities are being put into relationships that haven't necessarily existed before. And while there is a lot of local strength and will, that needs to be supported and accompanied in order to adapt to these new changes that are being brought about by external actors. And until that becomes something that communities themselves can propose solutions rather than outside actors determining them, until that transformation can happen, it becomes much more difficult for any outside actor, whether it's a UN agency, whether it's a relief group, a development group, or a local government, to enter into that community. Because if there's not a consensus among the people who are most affected about the solution, you can't have an outside actor then come in and support a solution. So I think those are sort of the three things that we're doing. I'm happy to talk in a lot more detail, either about specific geographies or to talk about specific approaches that we're using. But I wanted to leave that with perhaps the final thought that ultimately, while there are a number of very, very bleak challenges, these are the challenges that people wake up with and face every day, and problems that people are used to solving and coping as best they can. And so we see ourselves as being there to support them. But we hope that sort of the broader policy community also is in a position to listen without necessarily the rush to judgment, to even the definition of who is and who isn't the problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Vanita, and thank you, Jack. Very connected yet distinct presentations that give us valuable additional inputs into this rich day. So why don't we turn the floor over to questions? You've been here all day. You know the drill. We have microphones. We ask for short questions rather than talks. And let's get started down here and then over there. We have two on that side.
Lawrence Freeman from Africa Desk at Executive Intelligence Review. I've been involved in Africa development for about 25 years. And without the infrastructure in water, power, and rail, none of these problems would be solved. I mean, 70,000 megawatts of electrical power for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is horrible. If you look at the Lake Chad, for example, I was asked to be a member of the Lake Chad Basin Commission Scientific Committee. I was out there in November. That region could have been transformed. There's a proposal for TransAqua to take water from the Congo River Basin up to Lake Chad, which is 2,000 square kilometers. We have solutions. They require technology, they require infrastructure. We're not doing them. The BRICS Bank may be doing them now. The AIB may be doing them now. China's Silk Road may be doing them now. The West is not doing it. I don't understand why. And I think one of the problems is two of the premises here today. One, that more people is a problem. I don't agree. I agree with Prime Minister Modi. 1.2 billion people is not a curse, it's a gift. And two, man is not causing the environmental problems. They're solar and galactic. So we have to get rid of these prejudicial notions and actually get into infrastructure development, which the West has given up for the last 30, 40 years.
Terrific. Thank you. We have a question over here in the back. Then we'll come down here to the front.
Tom Timberg, consultant. I wondered if you could give a little bit more detail.
We're having a hard time hearing you, sir.
A little bit
Thanks.
more detail on the partners you've been able to develop, particularly you were talking about in Maiduguri and, how do I say, eastern northern Nigeria. In western northern Nigeria, there are a number of existing, you talked about lack of NGOs. There have been a lot of civil society activities, and there's certainly a large feudal structure, if you will. Part of the reason for Maiduguri being the kind of place it is the relative weakness of those traditional things. So if you could talk a little bit about the strategy for developing local partners, which you're using.
Okay, well, Benjamin, we'll take one more down here and then give the panel a chance to respond.
Thanks. Michael Boyce with Refugees International. I just wanted to raise perhaps a cautionary note related to Vanita's presentation. In many of these countries, we are seeing humanitarian needs quickly outstripping the amount of funding that is available to respond to them. And I think one of the concerning things as I look out to the CVE initiatives that the U.S. is putting forward is that we might very well face situations where if particular NGOs and civil society groups want to remain involved in a given country, in a given crisis, that they may need to increasingly look at CVE-related programming and funding in order to actually, stay in business and keep serving the populations that need help. And of course, the more that they do so, the greater the danger is that they are going to be perceived as targets by, organizations like Boko Haram or ACME, whom they need to negotiate access with in order to reach populations who are vulnerable. So I guess maybe what I would urge and encourage is that, if USAID is going to be rolling out this program, that we make sure that it's not a matter of recalibrating and reallocating the funding that USAID currently has to do more of CVE-related work, but rather that it be additive, so that we are not eating away at the really crucial life-saving services that need to be provided as we continue to face these crises.
Okay, terrific. Well, we have infrastructure, strategy for developing local partners, and additional rather than moving around the pots of money. So we can do a divide and conquer, and folks can...
I'll talk about infrastructure. I agree with you, Lawrence. People, as Mike said, people are not problems in and of themselves. They are opportunities, but there's a huge difference between 2 million people living in a city like Amsterdam or 2 million people scattered across refugee camps. One group is achieving great potential, the other is a constant source of frustration because it's unable to achieve its potential. Infrastructure is part of the problem, but it's not just physical or technical infrastructure. There's social infrastructure, and that's actually the more troubling part, because you really can't benefit from laying down physical infrastructure if you don't have security of property, if you don't have order, if you don't have an investment climate, if you don't have the ability to move electrical power or goods and services from one place to another. So the social infrastructure needs to be built at the same time as the technical. And we are both, learning how to do that, but also generally reluctant to do that, partly because you can't really impose social infrastructure from the outside. You can go in and build a bridge, but you can't go in and build a community in the same sense. Communities have to be linked up. They have to develop organic links. They have to develop trust, and that trust needs to go both directions, from government down and from the community up. That task is easier to carry out when there are adequate resources. And the adequacy of resources is limited when you have a low-income area with very rapid population growth. Now, Lagos is actually doing very well in recent years. The reason Lagos has gone from being something of a disaster to a promising growth spot is the local government has decided to take a hard line on corruption, to encourage private enterprise, to give support to business, and to make sure that when external and internal investment come in, they're not wasted. And kind of all it took to get Lagos pointed in the right direction was giving private capital the security and the opportunity to start to develop. And that's made big improvements. But that hasn't extended to the rest of Nigeria. So that northern and northeast Nigeria are still areas with very little social and political infrastructure, very little opportunity for young people, and sadly also the most rapid population growth in the region, precisely where there are the fewest opportunities for young people to find productive work. So I would say you're absolutely right about you need more infrastructure. People themselves are not a concern, but things need to be put in balance. The problem right now is we're worried about things being out of balance between a growing young population, the availability of work, the availability of resources, the security of investment, the ability of government to maintain order, and bringing those things into balance, I think, is the way forward, not just pushing this or that particular lever by itself, but thinking holistically.
Having lots of buttons to push, right, Mike? Yeah.
Maybe I'll do the partnerships one. And so, so that's an excellent question. I mean, obviously, building on what's there is central to our approach, and also not prejudicing to say we need this or that kind of partnership or relationship, but rather adapting to support what is there. And like you said, the environment in northeastern Nigeria is quite different from northwestern Nigeria. It has a different political history, a different social history. And also has not had the same sort of outgrowth of civil society, globalized organizations that elsewhere in Nigeria or West Africa have had. At the same time, it's not as though there's nothing there, or as if people have been sitting sort of on their hands passively, waiting for an emir or waiting for a different kind of structure to be imposed. And you know, in a pragmatic way, we work right now. We work very closely with both the state and local governments where they're still present. There are different kinds of interesting entry points. Working with the truckers' unions, for example, things like working with widows' associations, UNICEF, and a number of the humanitarian organizations had a lot of support networks and groups and clubs for child survival that in some places are still existing. And so you adapt and you work with what's there. And the approach that we're using is really to focus on supporting communities to map out their own safety and security plans in how they choose to manage their areas and where they see the resource people as being. So that's what we're doing. And there are groups there, but of course you're quite right that both historically it hasn't been as structured as other parts of Nigeria, and also due to the effects of the war and now the years and years of crisis and displacement, the different kinds of structures are no longer there that once were. But we do find it as a place where there is still that will to change, the will to make a change if people have that opportunity.
Let me take Mike's question. So Mike, thank you. That's a good question. And let me just clarify, it's not either or. So we're not replacing humanitarian assistance for countering violent extremism efforts. In certain areas, we don't even call it countering violent extremism or insurgency or conflict. It's what the community wants to name it. It's community stability, harmony. So it's really the community face on it. And our Office of Disaster Assistance, OFDA, funds a lot of displaced communities in that area. And we fund a lot of, as you know, civil society as well as nonprofit organizations that work in the areas. So you're right. We have to calibrate the response effectively to the situation and not try to undermine good efforts that are already ongoing or efforts that want to come in. Countering violent extremism is what we call it. When the community wants to call it by the words that are most appropriate for that situation, it's what we adapt to. Thanks.
Okay, some more questions? All the way in the back, please.
Hi, my name is Mike McGahey, USAID and USDA retired. I had the pleasure of sharing the table with Mike at lunchtime, and we talked about conflict and natural resources management, as Mike was saying. some of the old systems, particularly the pastoralist and farmer relationships, have broken down. He's quite correct in that. But we also talked about natural resource management as a solution. And I was relaying to him that USAID in 2004 funded a study by Sahelians, not by expats, but by Sahelians, to take stock of what was going on in the Sahel in the regreening. And one thing that they found was that herders and pastoralists were coming together over corridors and on-farm forestry. So they found that there were a lot of conflicts in some of these areas. It was not working for anybody. Local government helped them, but they themselves did the negotiation. And they came up with what they call convention locale. And these are rules made by them, enforced by them, and supported by the government. So I told Mike that perhaps I would throw him a question about if he could talk a little bit about cases where he has seen natural resource management or resources being a solution, being a vehicle for resolving conflict rather than just a problem, which it often is. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Do we have another? Yeah. Do we have any other questions before we give? I'm sorry, I just can't see. It's dark. There we go.
Thanks to the panel for very interesting presentations. I'm Casey McNeil. I'm a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins. And I have a question, I guess for everyone, kind of an observation in my own research that while sort of a contradiction or a tension between diagnoses of issues in the Sahel being linked to weak state capacity or kind of lack of consolidation of various state functions in the region, but then on the in terms of the sorts of where funding is going, the sorts of projects are largely through non-state groups and especially through sort of external groups that are largely, drawing on foreign programming and personnel and funding and these sorts of things. So just wondering about comments about sort of that trajectory of, on the one hand, this weak state discourse around diagnosing these problems, but that funding is really not going to kind of broad state state building. And I'm thinking specifically about the TSCTP program, which has a state capacity focus of its mission statement, but my understanding is except for Mauritania, really the programming is not being directed toward state institutions. And so in a place like Niger, for example, the government strategy for security and development is really having a lot of problems finding funding. So, yeah.
Okay, why don't we take one more and then we'll give our panel a chance to wrap.
Hi, my name is Halima Tuhima. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, also a consultant at the World Bank. I'm from Niger, and my question is directed to Search for Common Ground, the first question. You've talked about youth engagement as being one of the key three pillars to be worked on. And as we have seen from the presentation by the professor, if you're a young woman in Niger, if you make it through secondary school, you're extremely lucky. So how do you engage with these young women, or how do you ensure that in the way youth engagement happens, that segment of the population is still engaged? Because, what happens is that the way it's done, at least the way I've seen it done, is that it kind of includes these women by virtue of the fact that they are married in a different social, they are therefore in a different social group. My second question is directed to the professor. I don't know if you're, I really liked the graph that looked at the different trajectories, possible trajectories. And I know that if cases like Iran have happened, it's because something has happened. Do we have more understanding of what that something is? Because if Iran has managed to do it, then that opens a lot of possibilities for many other countries. Thank you.
Okay.
Should I take that?
Go, sure.
Let me take Tracy's question first. So Tracy, you are right in the sense that we do fund organizations, non-profit organizations that work, because USAID doesn't touch the money. We always implement through implementing partners. However, you're also right that the sense of the state is diffuse in many of these countries, and whether the state is a big question that's been asked across all topics, whether it's violent extremism or it's capacity building. However, we do fund through our bilateral programs governments, the governments that are under the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. So they're not devoid of funding. We have bilateral agreements with most of our presence countries and in places where we don't have missions. Many of the governments want to, like Mauritania, dictate where that funding will be spent. Other governments, not so much. They have a sense of their needs. We try to do capacity building through that, and we do a whole intake program, and we do a lot of risk assessments to understand where the capacity gaps are. Our State Department colleagues and our defense colleagues work directly government to government or with our regional multilateral partners, as we do. So we try to build up state institutions because the state is still the institution through which we work, while we try to support it, bottom up and top down and across. Thanks.
Okay. Dr. Mike?
Well, let me address several of these because I think they're related. When we talk about improving conditions in countries that are fragile or that have weak states, we sometimes think of everyone we're dealing with as well-motivated and looking for improvement. But the reality is political actors want to hang on to power. And their goals in holding on to power lead them to support a different kind of social structure than they might want to support if their goal was maximum development of the potential of everyone in their country. So, for example, pastoralists are often considered as problems by states because pastoralists are very hard to control and manage. And attacking pastoralists and taking over their land in order to establish state control is a frequent source of provoking conflict. So in Ethiopia, where I did some field work some years ago, they have wonderful pastoral resources, actually. The Somalis in the country are expert herders, but they are running out of grassland. They're facing climate problems, and their herds are not well managed. So they have a lot of skinny, underweight animals rather than really animals that could be brought for maximum profit to international markets. The government in Ethiopia, however, doesn't want to increase the wealth and independence of the Somali minority because that's a political problem for them. And so they're not really, they'll listen politely if you tell them all the things that can be done, but they would rather seize the land for agriculturalists and invite foreign investment to take land from pastoralists and exploit it in ways the state can better control. So it is a difficult challenge, and that's why I say we have to think holistically and not assume that, here's a problem, we can solve it without looking at the broader political context. So we try and promote better accountability. We certainly try to work with states as they are, but in many cases, the most immediate way to bring benefits is to work with the local communities or work with NGOs or try and keep certain programs out of government's reach. We've learned if you give money to governments for a lot of things, it doesn't get spent as one might hope. And so there's got to be a balance between working with states to try and improve how they operate, but also recognize that states and state actors may be working at cross purposes with you, and so you may have to try a different approach.
Terrific. Mike?
Thanks. And to take the two questions that I think were directed at me, thank you for that excellent setup. But I think it's quite useful to recognize what works in terms of local dispute resolution systems over natural resource management. At core of so many of the challenges of farmer-pastoralist dispute resolution or inter-community dispute resolution on natural resource management is the fact that there's not clear rules of the game, or the clear rules of the game that once prevailed no longer do, whether that's because the migratory corridor system is outdated and hasn't been updated to demographic reality, whether that's because populations have grown, because needs have changed, because borders in many cases have changed. And so the kinds of local systems that work in one place are both useful for that place, but can also provide a framework more broadly. I think one of the things that we've seen is often these systems come only at the after a dispute has already erupted, only after there have been violence between groups. We see it in Sudan, in Chad, and elsewhere. And so how you learn from places where there has been violence to take that to places where there hasn't been, so that you can take what works and get ahead of the curve, is something that's has been absolutely critical. And we're doing that a bit in Chad right now, working with local governments, civil society, and representatives of the different trade associations to agree not to the resolution of any particular farmer-herder dispute, but rather what are the rules of the game for how we're going to solve these when they happen, because we know that they will happen. The second kind of example that I think is interesting, and I don't know all of the details, but I know the bank, World Bank, DFID, and I think the Brits, the USAID, are investing in tanneries and abattoirs in Nigeria and revitalizing the leather trade, for example. And the kinds of economic interests that, the kind of economic programs that can create win-win solutions where you have settled communities, where you have settled women from farmer communities who are doing, tanning of herders, cattle, the skins from herders' cattle, can create a lot of value add. And so natural resources can benefit in a much more inclusive way if done in a way that's politically smart. And to come to the question of including women, of course, in Niger, that is a very sensitive challenge, in finding appropriate ways to particularly give young women an opportunity to speak out in the public square, and like you said, often young unmarried women, for example, which occupy in many ways a different social role than married women who are in some ways elder in the configuration. And one way that we found to be particularly effective is through what we call participatory theater. It's these roving bands of comedians. We're doing this right now in how you resolve the resource stresses as people flee from Boko Haram into Difa, into Mainly Soroa, and a number of very poor areas. How you resolve water disputes, for example, in a competition. You take a band of comedic actors who have been specially trained to go to a village, to listen to people, to what the problems are that they're dealing with in the morning as the women and men are going out to do their daily activities. As they're out, you write a play about it in a way that's a bit like Hamlet. You write it in a way that's been abstracted a bit, so that when people come back, you perform the play for the village. You bring in 400 people, 500 people come for this diversion, but you act out the situation. You act out the scenario that's being lived in a way that ends badly, and then you say, okay, well, does this happen here? Young woman, come on stage. Come. If this was you, if this was your older brother, how would you think he should behave? And you invite people on in a way that's much more culturally appropriate. It's an abstract discussion. It's not as stressful as a big political discourse, but it's a clever and entertaining and an engaging way that you invite her, and then you might invite the mayor and say, okay, well, if you were her son, how would you react to this? If you were the neighbor, how would you react? And that way you can facilitate a discussion in a way that doesn't necessarily put the same stresses on people. And so, I mean, we've done this kind of methodology even in cattle camps with Dinka in Sudan. I mean, it's quite, and you can do this in ways that are quite engaging. And so you need to think a little bit creatively and think about what's appropriate and how people, and by putting the challenge to people, by putting the challenge to young women about how young women can be more involved and listening in that way, you can come up with different kinds of solutions that can be a lot more effective. But I agree entirely that not only participation of women, but participation of young married women is absolutely critical. I think one of the other things that we learned was in Zinder, where there's a lot of issues with gang violence. One of the key things, of course, is not necessarily only what young men think, even though they're most involved in gang violence, but what young women are looking for in a boyfriend. And it's the young women who influence not just the mothers, but it's what young women expect of a man that shapes what men try to become. And so when you're working with these kids in these kinds of settings, understanding the role that young women can play in the very intricate role. At the end of the day, these are human problems, and women can play a very, very clever and useful role. Thanks.
Terrific. Well, I think we'll end on that both serious, but also in the case of the theater troops, comedic and positive, uplifting, and even entertaining note. And so, as I invite my good friend Roger Mark D'Souza to come up and introduce day's last speaker, please join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent presentation.
Thank you very much, Jeff. What a full and great day. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Tom Stoll, who's the Acting Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, DACHA, at USAID. And Tom and his team are supporting some of the work that we're doing here at the Wilson Center under our Resilience for Peace project, which is looking at the connections between conflict, the environment, fragility, and peace building. As you see from Tom's background, he has extensive experience at USAID, having worked in Kenya, the West Bank and the Gaza programs, southern Iraq, the Food for Peace office in Washington, D.C., and was director of the Iraq Reconstruction Office in Washington and mission director for Lebanon, Ethiopia, and Iraq. So Tom is going to offer some of his thoughts and perspectives on the topics that we have been discussing today. So, Tom?
Thank you very much, Roger Mark. It's great to be here. It's great to see you all here. It's my pleasure to be here again. And as you say, we've got a partnership here, so I've really appreciated the time here and the dialogue we've had and the relationship that we have here with the Woodrow Wilson Center. And thank you especially for this important event that you've had on the Sahel. And I'd like to offer a few closing reflections to what I'm sure was a fascinating day-long discussion. I've talked to Roger Mark and a couple of the participants. Unfortunately, I wasn't here the whole day, so I've missed all of that. But from what I hear, and I'm sure it was a very fascinating and useful discussion. And I'm glad that some of my colleagues, Alexandra, Vanita, Sylvia, others from USAID were here to talk with you in more depth about our efforts in the Sahel region especially. As you know, and as you've discussed, the Sahel is in many ways kind of a ground zero for advancing USAID's mission to end extreme poverty and promote democratic, resilient societies. Africa is one of the world's fastest growing regions, and it is also, unfortunately, home to more than 1/3 of those living in extreme poverty. Many of these poorest countries are in the Sahel. And if we are to unlock Africa's promise, we must tackle the drivers that keep Sahelians trapped in this cycle of crisis and extreme poverty. So as I'm sure you discussed earlier, population pressure is an important driver of vulnerability. In Niger, for instance, which has the highest birth rate in the world, the population is expected to double by 2035, not very long from now. And the UN projects that the population in the Sahel will be 340 million by 2050, triple the size today, and more than 10 times the size it was in 1950. So as a result, more and more people are struggling to survive with limited land, limited resources, and limited economic opportunities. So these pressures are compounded by a changing climate. More frequent droughts are making it harder for farmers to grow food and families to feed their children. Because of chronic malnutrition, one bad harvest can drive a community over the cliff. Sadly, many communities are forced into conflict over grazing, over water, or other resources. And we know that extreme poverty is increasingly concentrated in fragile states. Sahel is a prime example. While Senegal, Burkina Faso, Niger have taken democratic steps in recent years, the region remains blighted by terrorism. Disenfranchised young people without land, without jobs or a sense of security and justice are all too often lured into violent extremism, as you were talking about in your last session here. Gender disparities are pervasive, and we all know it's hard for a country to get ahead if half of its population is left behind. These complex challenges combine to result in great vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities to drought, to conflict, to terrorism, that have kept millions across the Sahel in a state of perpetual humanitarian crisis. But despite these challenges, governments in the Sahel have taken some important steps recently to help the most vulnerable break out of that cycle of crisis, poverty, food insecurity. There are hopeful re-greening efforts underway in Niger and Burkina Faso. And we're heartened by the government of Niger's decision to put a quarter of its budget towards Nigerians, nourish Nigerians, a plan to increase food security. As I'm sure my colleagues have mentioned, we have also changed the way we do business within USAID to meet these challenges. Our new resilience policy seeks to help the world's most vulnerable bounce back better from recurring crises that keep communities locked in extreme poverty. These efforts are in support of country-led programs like in Niger. In Dakar, back in 2012, we brought together our humanitarian and development teams to form what we call a Regional Joint Planning Cell, JPC, for the Sahel. This followed one we had started the year before in Ethiopia and Kenya in East Africa when I was the director in Ethiopia. This cell identifies underlying vulnerabilities, many of which you've discussed today. They assessed how population pressure, climate change, spikes in food prices, weak governance were driving the same communities into crisis year after year. They then designed joint humanitarian and development programs that target these root problems and, importantly, recognize risk factors as a daily reality. So, for instance, we assume in these programs that droughts are likely. Rather than putting it over here on your assumptions that you hope it doesn't happen, you plan for it. So, and then we build in what we call crisis modifiers into our programs, funds from our humanitarian account that can be put into a development program to reduce losses when a drought or other risk factor actually could hit. So one of the most exciting projects we have designed is RISE, and I understand you've heard about that mentioned a few times today, standing for Resilience in the Sahel Enhance. So RISE provides $130 million regionally to give 1.9 million of the Sahel's most vulnerable people a chance to break out of that cycle of crisis, escape chronic poverty, and lessen their need for future humanitarian assistance. So in targeted zones in Niger and Burkina Faso, hopefully we'll expand beyond that, but right now that's our main focus. RISE includes economic, governance, health, and nutrition investments from a variety of pots of money to build the capacity of pastoralists to thrive peacefully. For instance, we're giving farmers access to early warning information to practice climate-smart farming and promote more efficient water use. Of course, we know that women are often the pillar of stability in the household. So that's why we're giving them greater access to credit and savings so that they can build up household assets and go beyond living day by day. Given the demographic challenges of the region, we know that family planning is critical if we are to empower women to plan ahead. And so our Office of Population and Reproductive Health is collaborating closely with our resilience teams to provide mobile family planning services in these focused resilience zones. So you can see it's a multi-dimensional program. And so through this RISE program and our support to the Global Alliance for Resilience in the Sahel, we're also bolstering the capacity of governments to execute inclusive growth strategies, manage natural resources, including ensuring that women have land rights, and invest in disaster risk reduction. And we're also working with local communities so that they can have their voices heard in government policies and propose local solutions to mitigate conflict and manage resources more wisely. Now, USAID has also, separately from the RISE program, we've partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation and Swedish SIDA, to launch what we're calling the Global Resilience Partnership, GRP, which will leverage $150 million, that's $50 million from each organization over the next 5 years, to scale up resilience innovations in 3 target regions, one of which is the Sahel. Now, the GRP's first activity, a Global Resilience Challenge, has already produced a number of finalist teams that are looking to tackle issues such as, for pastoralists, including how to expand microcredit and insurance, both for pastoralists and farmers. So looking at innovative solutions from the local communities in conjunction with other partners. And so we hope that RISE and our other resilience investments will create a more virtuous cycle of peace and prosperity for Sahelians. We'll continue to innovate and learn from our efforts as we try to bring these resilience investments to scale. And discussions like this today, research partners like the Woodrow Wilson Center will help to continue to make us more informed and to use evidence-based investments in this region. And I'm certain that there are many rich insights in today's discussion that you have gathered up. I'm really looking forward to seeing those, to reading more about the discussions and the outcomes today. And thank you very much. And I don't know if we have some time for questions. If people have, I'd be happy to answer some questions. Thank you very much.
We have a couple minutes if there are any questions.
You've probably had them all answered today during the discussion, including some of our USAID colleagues there too. So, yes, ma'am. We got to. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks for your remarks. One of the things that I've noticed is that although there is clearly a need for regional collaboration, there have been only a couple of mentions of the regional structures in the Sahel, which admittedly have their weaknesses, SILS and ECOWAS and UMOA and so forth.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could, how do you see these institutions or other institutions as building a local capacity for cross-country collaboration?
Yeah, no, that's a good point and a critical point, because you want to build local capacity, as you say, not just in the community or even in the governments, but in the region. And so under our resilience program with this Global Resilience Partnership and our other resilience efforts, we are working very directly with regional entities. So for instance, in the Sahel, you have ECOWAS, as you mentioned. In the Horn of Africa, we're working very closely with the IGAD, the Internet Government. So they're sort of taking the lead, and we're trying to build their capacity to work regionally across many of these issues. Exactly. So and I'm glad you raised that point. And frankly, even for USAID, trying to work regionally is not easy. You know, our budgets come by country as well as by sector, and trying to pull that together is not easy, but it's critical, because obviously these problems don't stop at country borders, so you need to work across there. Thank you. Yes, back there.
Tom Timberg, two very specific questions about RISE.
Yeah.
One I could probably check on the web, but what regions within Burkina Faso and Niger are you working with? How many of them? I mean, in other words, what portion of the total country is covered? And then you mentioned the microcredit, so forth. You mentioned farmers and pastoralists. What about non-farm rural activities?
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, it is true that both in Niger and Burkina Faso, it's not the whole country. There's focus areas, and yeah, I mean, if I had a map here, I could show you, and I don't remember the names of the regions or governorates, but you can definitely look them up on the map there, and it does include areas getting close to Nigeria as well. So we're looking at the interplay between not only climate and poverty, but also some of the issues that you talked today about, the violent extremism and so on. Regarding the microcredit, as you mentioned, it's focused more on the farmers and the pastoralists, but there are others that we're still trying to figure out how do we do that. and again, working with the local communities, the local governments, and that's part of what we're trying to develop with these grand challenges, to get from some innovative solutions that we haven't maybe come up with on our own, on how to address those pockets of people who've moved to the city and they have no way of getting credit, and trying to figure that out. But that's an excellent point. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you very much, Tom. So, wow, what a day. 17 speakers, 11 countries in one region, one day, and I think a great lime. So we started this morning by saying that we wanted to lime, and that lime was to learn, internalize, modify, and build on our energy. And I think there are a few things that I took away from our discussion today. In terms of the L and the learning, having a sense of what's going on in the region, what's going on in the Sahel, I think was really good. I think we had a variety of perspectives. We heard from academics and analysts. We heard from folks who are involved in the policy arena. We heard from donors. We heard from service providers. We heard from projects on the ground. We heard from civil society. We heard from different sectors. We heard from folks who are working on the side of reproductive health, on food security and conflict, and humanitarian assistance, development. We heard from an ambassador. So a whole range of perspectives that we heard from today. And in terms of learning, I think we had really good discussions around points of entry. You know, we started this morning, and one of the comments that we heard from Micah was, wow, there's a lot going on. Where do we start? And her perspective is we start with women. Others were saying where we start with education, or we start with youth engagement, or we start with peace building. So I think we had some really good discussions about specific points of entry, because it's complicated. We're talking about multi-sectoral approaches. There are a number of initiatives going on, but there are clear points of entry that we could be thinking about. So in terms of the learning agenda for us and our discussion today, I took a lot away from that. It was in terms of internalizing and questioning what we were hearing, I thought we had a really good discussion. A number of panels had you asking questions about, well, what are some of the models about what we can learn elsewhere? How can that be applied to the Sahel? We had questions that asked us to push beyond the sectors that we were looking at. You're talking a lot about the agricultural sector. How can we learn about alternative livelihood development that's not in the agricultural sector? Some of our analysts were pushed to clarify the variables and assumptions in the models that they were putting out. We had questions around financing. We had questions around conflict and resilience and state legitimacy. And we had questions about talking about challenges. Where are the success stories? How do we capture those and learn from that? So I felt that we were really listening and thinking and reflecting, and that led to our questions around what we wanted to modify and how we could change things a little bit. We came away with a strong sense that there is strong donor interest in the region, that there's strong political will, that it seems to be an opportune moment for us to take action. But we had questions about what was culturally specific and sensitive, and how do we adapt what we're thinking of according to those cultural norms. We had questions about how does the Sahel come together as a region? What are we thinking in terms of a rationale regionally, but what does that mean in terms of how do we come in as external actors and leave this residual knowledge? How do we maintain state sovereignty, and what does it mean at a subnational level? So that kept coming up throughout the panels. A number of discussions about accountability structures for financing, for gender, for community engagement, for community mobilization, globalization, different models of planning, and how we can build that into how we think about the region. And once again, a lot of discussions about dynamics in its various forms. We talk about the geopolitical dynamics of the region. I think we talked about how do we, sitting in the United States, view the region and what are the impact of our coming into the region. We had questions about North Africa and how does that relate to the Sahel? What are the dynamics involved there? We had a very good discussion about the dynamic nature of resilience and being adaptive as we moved along and what it meant for adaptive management. And then we had a really, really good discussion around the dynamic nature of interactions and how do you do that as a development model? What does it mean for the humanitarian sector? What does it mean for conflict resolution and peace building? So this question of being dynamic and on our feet and adaptive kept coming back. So I was seeing us modifying and testing and not always agreeing and pushing and thinking about how does this apply to a specific country in the Sahel and how do we move beyond thinking just regionally. And then the energy, the E in that line, I got to tell you, I was sitting there and I'm getting emails from folks in Berkeley, California, who say, I have been up since 6:30. You guys have been doing great. I'm getting emails from folks in Niger saying, I'm looking, I'm listening, but I have to run to a meeting. So, I've listened for 2 hours, but I have to leave now. I'm going to come back. I want to see what has happened throughout our discussions today. Folks were sending me messages saying, oh, someone in the audience who did Peace Corps in Niger said, do you know Halima? And she's talking about those foot soldiers. Get her name. I want her name because I want to follow up. So we are here having this discussion, and there's a lot of energy in this room, but there are people who are tuning in virtually and listening and engaging and sending requests to us. So there's a lot of really good energy. So just to let you know what we do with the discussion that we've had today, it has been recorded, it will be archived, and it's available to you. All of the presentations that you've seen today will also be put online and are available to you. We write a blog summary of our discussion today, which will be put up on our blog, newsecuritybeat.org. So the materials that we touched on today, the discussion that we had, will have a long shelf life. We hope that you come back to it, engage, use it. We hope that you've had really good discussions among yourselves. We encourage you to continue to reach out to us in the Wilson Center. We are partners with you in this effort, and we hope that you continue to push us and help us think about how we continue to develop resilience in the Sahel. I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to USAID and colleagues. Shelley Snyder and her team have been really instrumental in allowing this to happen for us today. Thank you, Tom, to you and your team. I'd like to ask my colleagues from the Environmental Change and Security Program who are here to stand up. Is Lauren Hertzer here in the room? No? She's out doing something because she's the one who is the person who pulled this all together. Is Lauren nearby? No, she's probably doing something associated with today's event. But just to say a huge thank you to the team that helped pull this together. It really is a team effort. And thank you for coming today and for engaging and being part of this dialogue. It was fantastic. I got about 2 hours sleep last night because I was so excited thinking about today, and you made it worthwhile. So thank you.